53.
Long before the whiskey boat stopped, Elmira knew she was going to have trouble with Big Swey. The man had never approached her or even spoken to her, but every time she went out of her shed to sit and watch the water, she felt his eyes on her. And when they loaded the whiskey in wagons and started across the plains for Bent's Fort, his eyes followed her to whatever wagon she chose to ride for the day. It seemed to her it might be the fact that she was so small that made Big Swey so interested. It was a problem she had had before. Huge men seemed to like her because she was so tiny. Big Swey was even larger than the buffalo hunter who had caused her to run to July. Sometimes in the evening, when he brought her food, Father would sit and talk with her a bit. He had a scar which ran over his nose and down across his lips and into his beard. He had a rough look, but his eyes were dreamy. "This whiskey hauling business has about petered out," he said one evening. "Indians kept the trade going. Now they've about got them all pinned up down in these parts. I may go up north." "Are there many towns up north?" she asked, remembering that Dee had mentioned going north. Dee liked his comforts, hotels and barber shops and such. Once she had offered to cut his hair and made a mess of it. Dee had been good-natured about it, but he did remark that it paid to stick to professionals. He was vain about his looks. "There's Ogallala," Fowler said. "That's on the Platte. There's towns in Montana, but that's a long way." Big Swey had a deep voice. She could sometimes hear him talking to the men, even over the creak of the wagon wheels. He wore a long buffalo coat and seldom took it off, even when the days were hot. One morning, there was a great excitement. Just as the morning mist had begun to thin, the man on guard claimed to have seen 6 Indians on a ridge. He was a young man, very nervous. If there were Indians, they did not reappear. During the day, men surprised 3 buffalo and killed one of them. That night, Fowler brought Elmira samples of the liver and the tongue. The best parts, he said. The men had talked about the fort so much that Elmira had supposed it was a real town, but it was just a few scattered buildings, none in good repair. There was only one woman there, the wife of a blacksmith, and she had gone crazy due to the death of all 5 of her children. She sat in a chair all day, saying nothing to anyone. Fowler did his best for Elmira. He got the traders to let her have a little room, just a tiny dirty closet, really. It was next to a warehouse where piles of buffalo skins were stored. The smell of the skins was worse than anything that had happened on the river. Her room was full of fleas that had escaped from the skins. She spent much of her time scratching. Though the fort was nothing much to see, it was a busy place, with riders coming and going all the time. Watching them, Elmira wished she was a man so she could just buy a horse and ride away. The men let her alone, but they did look at her whenever she left her room. There were several wild-looking Mexicans who scared her worse than buffalo hunters. After a week of scratching, she began to realize that she had done a foolish thing, taking the whiskey boat. In Fort Smith, all she had felt was an overwhelming desire to go. The day she left, she felt that her life depended on getting out of Fort Smith that day. She had a fear that July would suddenly show up again. She didn't regret leaving, but neither did she calculate on landing in a place as bad as Bent's Fort. In the cow towns, stages came and went at least. If you didn't like Dodge, you could always go to Abilene. But no stage came to Bent's Fort. Just a wagon track that soon disappeared into the emptiness of the plains. Though she had not been bothered, the men at Fort Smith looked very rough. "They don't think you're worth robbing," Fowler said, but she wasn't sure he was right. Some of the Mexicans looked like they might do worse than rob her if the mood struck them. Once, sitting under the little shed outside her room, she saw a fight between 2 Mexicans. She heard a yell and saw each man pull a knife. They went at one another like butchers. Their clothes were soon bloody, but evidently the cuts were not serious, for after a while they stopped fighting and went back to gambling together. Fowler said there might be a party of hunters going north, and perhaps they would take her, but a week passed and the party didn't materialize. Then one day, Fowler brought her a little plate of food under the shed. He looked at her sheepishly as if he had something to say but didn't want to say it. "Big Swey wants to marry you," he said, finally, in an apologetic tone. "Well, I'm already married," she said. "What if he just wants to marry you temporary?" Fowler asked. "It's always temporary," Elmira said. "Why don't he ask himself?" "Swey ain't much of a talker," Fowler said. "I've heard him talk," she said. "He talks to the men." Fowler laughed and said no more. Elmira felt angry. She was in a spot if some man was wanting to marry her. Someone had thrown a fresh buffalo skin into the warehouse, and she could hear the flies buzzing on it from where she sat. "He'll take it to Ogallala if you do it," Fowler said. "You might think about it. He ain't as bad as some." "How would you know?" she asked. "You ain't been married to him." Fowler shrugged. "He might be your best bet," he said. "I'm going back downriver next week. A couple of hide haulers are taking a load to Kansas, and they might take you, but it'd be a hard trip. You'd have to smell them stinking hides all the way. Anyway, the hide haulers are rough," he said. "I think Swey would treat you all right." "I don't want to go to Kansas," she said. "I've been to Kansas." What ruined that was that she was pregnant and showing. Some of the saloons weren't particular, but it was always harder to get work if you were pregnant. Besides, she didn't want to work. She wanted Dee, who wouldn't mind that she was pregnant. Big Swey began to spend hours just watching her. He didn't pretend to gamble or do anything else. He just watched her. She sat under her shed in one patch of shade, and he sat in another about 30 yards away, just watching. He didn't pretend to gamble or do anything else. Once, when he was watching, some riders spotted a little herd of buffalo. The other hunters were wild to go after them, but Swey wouldn't go. They yelled at him and argued with him, but he just sat. Finally, they went off without him. One hunter tried to borrow his gun, but Swey wouldn't give it up. He sat there with his big rifle across his lap, looking at Elmira. It became amusing to her, her power over the man. He had never spoken to her, not one word, and yet he would sit for hours, 30 yards away. It was something, what must go through men's minds where women were concerned, to cause them to behave so strangely. One morning she came out of her closet earlier than usual. She had a touch of morning sickness and wanted some fresh air. When she opened her door, she almost bumped into Big Swey, who had just been standing outside her door. Her sudden appearance embarrassed him so that he gave her one appalled look and then turned and went off, practically at a trot, putting a safe distance between them. He was a very heavy man, and the sight of him trying to run made her laugh out loud, something she hadn't done in a while. He didn't turn to look back at her again until he was safely back in his spot, and then he turned fearfully, as if he expected to be shot for having stood by her door. "Tell him I'll go," she said to Fowler that evening. "I guess he ain't so bad." "You tell him," Fowler said. The next morning she walked over to where Big Swey sat. When he saw her coming, it seemed for a second like he might bolt, but she was too close. Instead, he sat as if paralyzed, fear in his eyes. "I'll go if you think you can get me to Ogallala," she said. "I'll pay you what it's worth to you." Swey didn't say anything. "How'll we travel?" she said. "I ain't much good at riding horses." Big Swey didn't respond for about a minute. Elmira was about to lose patience when he brushed his mouth with the back of his hand, as if to clean it. "Could get that there hide wagon," he said, pointing to a run-down piece of equipment a few yards away. To Elmira, the wagon didn't look like it could travel 10 yards, much less all the way to Nebraska. "Could get the blacksmith to fix it," Swey said. Now that he had spoken to her and not been struck by lightning, he felt a little easier. "Did you mean just us two to go?" Elmira asked. The question gave him so much pause that she almost wished she hadn't asked it. He fell silent again, his eyes troubled. "Might take Luke," he said. Luke was a weaselly little buffalo hunter with only a thumb and one finger on his left hand. He carried dice and gambled when he could get anyone to gamble with him. Once on the boat she had asked Fowler about him, and Fowler said a butcher had cut his fingers off with a cleaver, for some reason. "When can we go?" she asked. It turned out to be a decision Big Swey wasn't immediately up to making. He pondered the matter for some time but reached no conclusion. "I want to get out of here," she said. "I'm tired of smelling buffalo hides." "Get that blacksmith to fix that wagon." Swey responded. He stood up, picking up the tongue of the wagon, and began to drag it towards the blacksmith shop 100 yards away. The next morning, the wagon, more or less patched, was sitting outside her closet. When she walked over to inspect it, she saw that Luke was in it, sleeping off a drunk. He slept with his mouth open, showing black teeth, and not many of them at that. Luke had ignored her on the trip upriver, but when he woke up, he hopped out of the wagon and came right over, a grin on his weaselly face. "Big Swey and I partnered up," he said. "Can you drive a wagon?" "I guess I could if we go slow," she said. Luke had spiky red hair that stuck out in all directions. A skinning knife a foot long was slung in a scabbard under one shoulder. He grinned constantly, exposing his black teeth, and, unlike Swey, was not a bit afraid to look her in the eye. He had an insolent manner and spat tobacco juice constantly while he talked. "Swey went to buy some mules," he said. "We got 2 horses, but they don't do for the wagon. Anyway, we might get some hides while you're driving the wagon." "I don't like the smell of hides," she said pointedly, but not pointedly enough for Luke to get the message. "You get where you don't smell them after a while," he said. "I don't hardly even notice it. I've smelled them so much." Luke had a little quirt and was always nervously popping himself on the leg with it. "You scared the Indians?" he said. "I don't know," Elmira said. "Guess I don't like 'em much." "I've already killed 5 of them," Luke said. Big Swey finally arrived, leading 2 scrawny mules and carrying a harness he had traded for. The harness was in bad repair, but there was plenty of rawhide around, and soon they had tied together fairly well. Luke was quite dexterous with his thumb and little finger. He did better than Swey, whose hands were too big for harness making. She soon got the hang of driving the mules. There was not much to it, for the mules were content to follow the 2 men on horseback. It was only when the men loped off to hunt that the mules were likely to balk. On the second day out, with the men gone, she crossed a creek whose banks were so steep and rough that she felt sure the wagon would turn over. She was ready to jump and take her chances, but by a miracle, it stayed upright. That day, the men killed 20 buffalo. Elmira had to wait in the sun all day while they skinned them out. Finally, she got down and sat under the wagon, which provided a little shade. The men piled the bloody, smelly hides into the wagon, which didn't suit the mules. They hated the smell of hides as much as she did. Big Swey had lapsed back into silence, leaving all the talking to Luke, who chattered away whether anybody listened to him or not. Often, Elmira had a nervous stomach. The jostling of the wagon took getting used to. The plains looked smooth in the distance, but they were surprisingly rough to pass over. Big Swey had given her a blanket to put over the rough seat. It kept her from getting splinters, but didn't cushion the bumps. Alone with the 2 men in the middle of the great empty prairie, she felt apprehensive. In the cow towns, there had been lots of girls around. If a man got mean, she could yell. On the boat, it hadn't seemed as dangerous because the men were always fighting and gambling among themselves. But at night on the prairie, there were only 3 of them, and nothing much to keep anyone busy. Big Swey sat and looked at her through the campfire, and Luke looked too while he talked. She didn't know if Big Swey considered that in some way he had married her already. She worried that he might suddenly come over and want the marriage to begin, through so far as he had been too shy to even speak to her much. For all she knew, he might expect her to be married to Luke too, and she didn't want that. The thought made her so nervous that she couldn't eat the buffalo meat they offered her. Anyway, it was tougher than any meat she ever tried to chew. She chewed on one bite until the jaws got tired, then spat it out. But when she went to the wagon and made the one blanket into a kind of bed, neither man followed. She lay awake for a long time, apprehensive, but the men sat by the fire, occasionally looking her way, but making no move to disturb her. Luke got his dice out and they soon were playing. Elmira was able to sleep, but awoke to the roll of thunder a few hours later. The men were asleep by the dying fire. Across the prairie, she began to see lightning darting down the sky, and within a few minutes, big drops of water hit her. In a minute, she was wet. She jumped down and crawled under the wagon. It wasn't much protection, but it was some. Soon, lightning was crashing all around, and the thunder came in big, flat cracks, as if a building had fallen down. It frightened her so that she hugged her knees and trembled. When the lightning struck, the whole prairie would be bathed for a second in white light. The rainstorm soon passed, but she lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to water drip off the wagon. It grew very dark. She didn't know what might have happened to the men, but in the morning they were right where they had gone to sleep, wet as muskrats but ready to drink a pot of coffee. Neither even commented on the storm. Elmira decided they were used to hard traveling and that she had better get used to it too. Soon she began to talk to the mules as they plodded along. She didn't say much and the mules didn't answer, but it made the long hot days pass a little faster.